August 1944. A Sherman tank was written off before sunset. Its crew had crawled out through smoke, mud, and machine gun fire, while the engine bay burned behind them. The company report used the word everyone understood, lost. But before dawn, at a muddy repair point behind the line, a mechanic wiped soot from the side of the hull and found the old painted number still there. Not a replacement number, not a new vehicle, the same number. The tank that died yesterday was on the readiness sheet for tomorrow, and that single impossible line on a clipboard tells you more about the armored war in Europe than most tank duels ever could. Because the most important question was not always, can a Sherman kill a Panther? The better question was darker. How many times could an army survive losing the same tank? Normandy taught the answer in mud. The summer battlefield was not an open plain where armored knights met cleanly at distance. It was the bocage, tight lanes, sunken roads, hedgerows thick as walls, and fields that could turn into kill boxes in seconds. For American tankers, the war often shrank to a strip of muddy road and a slit of green ahead. A Panther could be waiting behind the next hedge. An 88 could be hidden behind a farmhouse wall. A gunner might spot the flash too late. A Sherman's 75mm round could strike the sloped front of a Panther and skip away like a stone off water. Another shot might do the same. Crews learned to aim for smoke, for tracks, for side armor, for anything except a fair frontal duel, because fair was a word the battlefield did not recognize. German armor had been built around a brutal belief: if one machine was powerful enough, it could dominate many lesser ones. The Panther and Tiger were not just vehicles. They were arguments made of steel, thick armor, long guns, high velocity, technical pride. A German commander in the right position could destroy Sherman after Sherman before anyone reached him, and the Americans knew it. They did not need a propaganda officer to tell them their tank was vulnerable. They lived inside that vulnerability. Every crewman knew the sound of a shell that missed, and the silence after one that did not. On the tactical ledger, the German idea looked terrifyingly correct. A Panther could knock out several Shermans. A Tiger could control a road. A single hidden anti-tank gun could stop a column and leave burning hulls in the lane. Reports from armored divisions piled up with the same cold rhythm. Tank hit. Crew bailed out, vehicle disabled, company down, battalion short. On paper, the American armored force should have been bleeding to death. But it did not. That was the contradiction. A unit might report 20 tanks knocked out in a day's fighting, then appear the next morning with only a handful missing from its operating strength. Some divisions suffered loss rates that would have shattered a smaller army. Yet their columns kept forming, kept moving, kept showing up at the next line of departure. To the men at the front it felt almost supernatural. To the Ordnance Corps it was Tuesday. The difference was hidden in one word: lost. A tanker used that word when his vehicle stopped fighting. A logistics officer used it only when the army could never make that vehicle fight again. Those were not the same thing, and between those two definitions was the American resurrection machine. Follow one Sherman through it. A shell strikes near the engine bay. It does not completely destroy the crew compartment, but it tears lines, jams metal, throws the track, and leaves the tank dead in a field. The crew escapes. The fight moves forward. From the road the Sherman looks finished, but its location is radioed back. A recovery team receives the grid. Now the clock starts. The disabled tank has to be pulled out before German artillery finds it, before the ground is lost again, before fire turns a repair job into a grave. Then a strange vehicle appears. It has a Sherman's body, but not a Sherman's purpose. No turret, no main gun. Instead, a crane, winches, tow bars, cables, toolboxes, and men who fight with grease under their fingernails. The M32 armored recovery vehicle was not built for glory. It was built for the ugly minutes after glory failed. Under mortar fire, under snipers, under the same sky as everyone else, the recovery crew hooks steel to steel. The winch bites, the engine strains. One tracked machine drags another out of the killing ground. Slowly, loudly, painfully, but moving, and once the dead tank reaches a forward repair point, the real American advantage becomes visible. The mechanics do not treat the Sherman like a cathedral. They treat it like a machine that was expected to break. If the engine is ruined, they do not spend precious days nursing it back to life piece by piece. They open the rear, unbolt the power pack, hook it to the crane, and lift the whole wounded heart out of the hull. Engine, accessories, mounting frame, gone. A truck brings another unit forward, pre-assembled, tested, standardized, ready to drop in. A tank can arrive dead after breakfast and be running again before dark. That was not an accident of field genius. It was design philosophy. The Sherman was made for war at industrial scale. Its parts were standardized. Its components were replaceable. A transmission built in one American plant could fit a hull made somewhere else. Road wheels, track blocks, periscopes, radios, bolts, and power units existed not as rare treasures, but as a flowing supply of mechanical life. The tank was not merely manufactured, it was supported. That support reached from American factories to ports, from ships to beaches, from depots to trucks, from trucks to muddy orchards a few miles behind the front. After the breakout from Normandy, when rail lines were wrecked and armies were outrunning their own supply, the Red Ball Express turned roads into arteries. Thousands of trucks ran day and night. Fuel, ammunition, rations, tires, engines, transmission parts. Men drove until their eyes burned, many of them African-American soldiers carrying the burden of an army that still denied them full equality, while relying on their endurance to keep the front alive. That was the part Germany had not solved. Germany had built remarkable tanks. America had built a way to keep ordinary tanks from staying dead. Now look at the other side of the line. A Panther breaks a final drive. It is not hit, it is not burning. Its gun works, its armor works, its crew is alive. But the tank cannot move, and for a Panther that failure is not simple. The machine is heavy, complex, tightly arranged, and difficult to repair in the field. Its interleaved road wheels can turn a damaged track or suspension job into hours of filthy labor. Its final drives carry enormous stress. The parts are not always near. The tools are not always available. The fuel for a recovery vehicle may not exist. A minor mechanical failure can become a permanent loss, not because the tank was defeated in a duel, because the system around it could not rescue it. A masterpiece that cannot be recovered is only a monument waiting to be abandoned. That truth grew worse as the war moved west. By the winter of 1944, Germany made one last enormous gamble in the Ardennes. December 16, fog over the forests, snow on the roads, American lines thin and surprised. Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers pushed forward in the last great armored lunge of the German war. At first the attack looked like the old nightmare returning. Shermans were destroyed, roadblocks were smashed, small units were overrun. Allied aircraft were grounded by weather. German columns surged through gaps in the line, and for a few days the map seemed to bend under their weight. But the same fatal arithmetic followed them into the snow. Heavy tanks are hungry. A King Tiger did not just need fuel, it devoured fuel. In bad weather, on frozen roads, in traffic, with supply lines stretched and harassed, every mile became a logistical wound. And the German offensive was racing toward fuel it did not control. At the same time, mechanical failures multiplied. Transmissions, final drives, tracks, engines. The very machines meant to deliver a decisive blow began consuming their own strength just by moving. Then the old decision returned. Can we recover it? Can we fix it? Can we fuel the recovery vehicle? Can we tow 70 tons through ice and forest under enemy pressure? Again and again the answer was no. So the crews did what soldiers do when no system is left behind them. They destroyed what they could not save. They walked away from tanks whose armor had never been pierced. In the Ardennes, some German machines were not defeated by American shells. They were defeated by empty tanks, broken gears, blocked roads, and the absence of a recovery system strong enough to follow the dream of the perfect weapon. Meanwhile, American repair crews worked in the cold behind their own battered line. Engines came out, new engines went in, damaged bogies were stripped from wrecks, radios were swapped, tracks were rebuilt. Armor patches were welded onto hulls that looked too scarred to be useful and then sent right back toward the front. These were not beautiful tanks. They were stitched tanks, patchwork tanks, tanks with mismatched parts and fresh paint over old burns. But they moved, they fired, they occupied crossroads, they gave exhausted infantry something solid to form around. And that was the secret hidden beneath the argument about armor thickness. The Sherman's greatest advantage was not that it refused to die. It was that the army behind it refused to let death be simple. That changes the meaning of power. Power is not only the gun that can win the first exchange. Power is the engine waiting in the truck, the recovery vehicle under fire, the mechanic who knows which bolts matter, the driver who keeps a convoy moving through blackout roads, the inventory clerk who knows where the next transmission is, the system that turns a smoking loss into tomorrow morning's fighting strength. Germany had created some of the most feared armored vehicles of the war. America had created an industrial ecosystem that could absorb damage faster than Germany could make victory permanent. One army designed tanks to win engagements. The other designed a machine around the tank to survive a war. But once that truth becomes visible, it reveals a second truth. If a tank is only the armored tip of a system, then defeating a tank does not always require piercing its armor. Sometimes you can attack what gives it life. The British learned that lesson far from the hedgerows of Normandy in the open desert of North Africa. 1942, a gun crew stood beside a 40mm Bofors cannon and looked at a problem the gun was never meant to solve. The Bofors was an anti-aircraft weapon. It was built to fire at diving aircraft, not at German armor. Its sights were designed for the sky. Its shells were meant to burst near thin-skinned planes. Even the gun itself had been fitted with elevation stops, metal limits that kept the barrel from depressing fully toward the ground. It was a weapon with its face turned upward, but on the horizon the danger was not in the sky. It was a dust cloud. A German armored column was coming, and the British anti-tank gun that should have stopped it, the old 2-pounder, was no longer enough against improved Panzer armor from the front. So the crew did something that was not doctrine. They took tools to the gun. The stops came off. The barrel dropped toward the horizon, and the gun that had been told all its life to look up finally stared straight ahead. At first glance, this sounds foolish. A 40mm high-explosive shell was not going to punch clean through the face of a Panzer IV. The frontal armor was not the target. That was the discovery. The German Panzer attack looked like tanks, but it was never only tanks. It was a combined arms organism. Tanks at the front, infantry and half-tracks close behind, command vehicles with radios. reconnaissance cars, artillery observers, mortar teams, fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, repair vehicles, medical vehicles, the whole moving body of the assault. The tank was the tooth. The column behind it was the bloodstream, and most of that bloodstream was thin-skinned. So the Bofors gunner let the leading tanks pass through his sight picture. One Panzer, then another. Then the support column emerged from the dust, a fuel truck, a radio car, a half-track packed with infantry. The order came, target right, the Bofors fired. The effect was nothing like a failed anti-tank shot. A high-velocity 40mm shell hitting a soft-skinned vehicle did not politely disable it. It tore it open. A fuel truck could become a tower of flame. A half-track could be shredded before the infantry inside even understood the attack had shifted behind the tanks. A command vehicle could lose its radio, its driver, and its authority in the same burst. The Bofors did not hit like one bullet, it swept. 2 shells a second, 4-round clips, a flat trajectory across open desert. A gun designed to catch aircraft now drew a horizontal line through the weak organs of a Panzer formation. The tanks kept their armor, but they lost their team. That was the intellectual breakthrough. The British had been losing a problem defined by German rules. Anti-tank gun versus tank. So they changed the target. They stopped asking how to crack the fist and began cutting the arm that moved it. A lone Panzer still looked terrifying from the front, but a Panzer with no infantry screen is exposed. A Panzer with no fuel is temporary. A Panzer with no radio is confused. A Panzer with no artillery observer is blind. A Panzer separated from its column is no longer a spearhead. It is a steel box with a deadline. The Bofors became an anti-formation weapon. Not officially at first. Like many battlefield truths, it passed from crew to crew before it passed through headquarters. A veteran sergeant would point at the stops, then at the desert, then at the next dust cloud on the horizon. Take those off, you'll see. But the evidence became too loud to ignore. Ammunition logs showed anti-aircraft shells disappearing while the sky was empty. Reports from the front described German attacks breaking apart before the tanks themselves were destroyed. Command vehicles burning, half-tracks abandoned, fuel trucks scattered, armored thrusts slowing, hesitating, losing shape. Soon the unauthorized trick had become a method. The Bofors was still not a tank killer in the heroic sense. It was something more dangerous to a doctrine built on coordination. It was a formation breaker. Now imagine the view from inside a German tank. The commander sits behind armor he trusts. He expects the British guns to strike his front plate. He expects sparks, smoke, perhaps a lucky penetration if the range closes. Then the radio crackles and dies. He turns in the turret. Behind him, the half-track carrying his infantry support is burning. The truck with fuel drums is a black column. A command car has stopped sideways across the road. Men are running. Drivers are reversing into one another. The attack still has tanks, but it no longer has rhythm. The spear has lost its shaft, and every second it sits confused. British anti-tank guns have time to do the work they were built for. That was the same lesson from the opposite direction. In France and Belgium, the Americans proved that a weaker tank could keep fighting if it belonged to a stronger system. In North Africa, the British proved that a stronger armored attack could be stopped if you broke the system around it. Both lessons attacked the same myth. The myth that war is decided by the visible machine alone. A Panther was not just a Panther. It was fuel, spare parts, radios, trained crews, recovery vehicles, roads, mechanics, orders, infantry, and timing. A Sherman was not just a Sherman. It was Detroit, depots, red ball trucks, M32 recovery crews, ordnance mechanics, replacement engines, standardized parts, and a doctrine that expected failure before failure arrived. A Bofors was not just an anti-aircraft gun. It became a way of seeing the enemy properly, and that is why the old question is too small. Could a Panther kill a Sherman? Yes, often. Could a Tiger dominate a road? Yes. Could a Bofors punch through a Panzer's front armor? Usually not. But those questions mistake the duel for the war. The real question is what happens after the duel. Can the damaged tank be recovered? Can the engine be replaced? Can the convoy still move? Can the radio net still function? Can the infantry stay with the armor? Can fuel reach the spearhead before the spearhead outruns its own life? A weapon is never only what it can destroy. It is also what keeps it alive. By 1944, the battlefield had delivered its verdict in steel, oil, smoke, and snow. The German pursuit of the perfect armored machine created fearsome vehicles, but fearsome vehicles still needed an organism around them. When that organism starved, broke, or lost its nerves, even the strongest tank became an object waiting for the enemy. The Allied answer was less glamorous and more decisive. Recover the wreck, replace the heart, feed the road, cut the column, attack the system. That was why a Sherman could be knocked out on Monday and fight again on Wednesday. That was why a Bofors gun, aimed at trucks instead of armor, could stop an attack it was never supposed to face. And that was why the true measure of a tank's power was not always found in the thickness of its armor or the size of its gun. It was found in what happened when the tank failed, because the army that understands failure can turn wreckage back into force, and the army that does not understand failure can leave its finest machines standing untouched in the snow, useless and alone. The duel made legends. The system decided the war.